And first of all, just start with the kind of impact you see this, particularly in the short term, having for the overall Kenyan economy.
Well, I think we should start by saying that the VAT bill was long overdue. We needed a reform of our VAT legislation. And I actually do believe that what we have come up with is a very good piece of legislation. The problem is that we are moving from an extreme of giving too many exemptions and zero rating status to giving none at all. And as a consequence, a number of basic commodities that the common man relies on are going to end up being taxed at the standard rate of 16%, which in the short term, of course, will result in price rises. And I think in a time when we're just coming off double-digit inflation, that probably isn't the best thing for our economy.
I was going to ask you about that inflation. So do you think that perhaps there could have been a more gradual way of this bill coming into effect?
Well, to some extent they have done that, because there are certain items, for example, medical supplies, where they've said that it will become taxable at the full rate of 16% at the end of 3 years from enactment. But my concern is not so much that as basic food stuff, which I think needs to be taxed at 0%. And indeed, I don't think there should be a transitional arrangement. I think it should be taxed at 0% all the way through, which is common with many regimes around the world.
One of the things that has been said, though, is that the Kenyan cabinet bowed to public pressure and they resolved to remove food items from the intended review of the VAT bill. So far, what are you hearing? Have they removed food prices, or is that still on the table?
The whole thing is still on the table right now. It's very clear that the Revenue Authority and the Treasury believe that the bill should get enacted the way it is. Our members of Parliament, a couple of weeks ago, when it was actually tabled before them, it suddenly dawned on them that basic food prices are going to go up, and the whole thing was withdrawn from Parliament. So I think we still have some time for manoeuvre and lobbying and discussion. But it's not a lot of time, and clearly the bill does have to be enacted sooner rather than later, because our revenue projections for 2012-13 rely very heavily on the bill coming into law.
Let's just talk a little bit about what's been happening on international markets, particularly when it comes to food prices. I mean, you're already having global leaders saying that they might be meeting later on this year to have probably what they're calling an emergency meeting to discuss these escalating food prices, particularly the prices of grain. So when you see what's happening on the international front, and then you'd see these proposals happening in Kenya, right now, at this time, is this a time to be looking at a bill like this, particularly if it would affect food prices?
I think your question is in two parts. Should we have a new bill? Yes, we should, because our existing legislation is not very robust, and there's certainly a lot of revenue leakage. Should it include taxation of basic food prices? I think the answer to that is no. And one of the points the Revenue Authority is making is that that unprocessed food, maize flour, unprocessed milk, wheat flour, will continue to be exempt from tax. But my view is that while that might help people in the rural areas, it's not going to help people in the urban areas. And I'm not talking here about the more affluent in our society. If you look around Nairobi in the slum areas, there are a significant number of people that rely very heavily on these basic foods that they need on a daily basis. And if you add 16% to them, I think you're creating problems for yourself.
Okay, so even say the government does decide, well, they're going to take food off the table when it comes to applying VAT to food, you've also got the whole issue of the value chain, so the production of food. I mean, there are going to be things that go into that input cost that will impact the cost of food in any case.
Well, not if we have the food as a zero-rated supply rather than an exempt supply, because if it is a zero-rated supply, then the supplier can actually reclaim the input VAT that they're suffering. Now, I think what I'm suggesting is that we certainly need to have the new legislation. We certainly need to restrict the number of things that are exempt, zero-rated, the number of remissions we give. But I think we've moved from an extreme of giving everything zero rating and exempt to nothing, and there's that middle ground which I don't think we've necessarily found, and that's the debate that we should be having today.
Nikhil, would you be able to give some kind of projection of how much revenue this would add to the Kenyan economy if this were to come into effect?
It's very interesting, because when we heard it in the budget speech, we were talking about 50 billion shillings. But yet there is, in February, a cabinet paper which suggests that the new bill will result in 5 billion shillings. So I think while we've put in all these new provisions, I don't think anyone has really got a firm feel for how much more tax we're going to collect. There's no doubt we will collect more because we're taxing more things. But the exact amount, anywhere between 5 and 50 billion, I would think.
Let's talk a little bit about investment, because I would imagine that having, you know, some of those exemptions has probably been one of the reasons that, or something that has attracted business and investment into Kenya. Do you see that being impacted at all going forward?
In the long run, I don't think so. I've always said that we give too many exemptions and reliefs under tax, and I firmly believe that a foreign investor coming into Kenya does not base his decision entirely on the tax breaks he's getting. I mean, there's got to be a commercial reason for coming into the country. You're not going to come in there because you're getting a 30% tax break, because that's not necessarily going to make your project economically viable. So to me, again, this is an area where we've moved from giving plenty of remissions to giving no remissions in the VAT bill. Again, there is a middle ground. We do need to focus on particular sectors of the economy, and agriculture, I think, would be one of them, because it remains the backbone of our economy. We have significant small-scale farmers all over the country. So if you focus your incentives and you focus your tax breaks for them rather than giving blanket tax breaks, then I think it's better for the country. I
want to talk a little bit about the system right now as it stands, the practitioners and the people that would have to deal with this once it is in place. How ready is Kenya for this bill to come into effect?
Look, I don't think that we're going to have any issues with it, because we've been operating VAT since 1990. In the early years, it took some time to settle when people started to understand how they had to operate VAT. Maybe our sensitization program back then was not as good as it could have been. But given that we've been operating it for 12, 14 years now, I don't see moving things from one rate of tax to another as being something that is going to hinder people from doing it. We continue to have the problem of evasion of tax, and we continue to have the problem of not having a wide enough tax base. So the VAT bill is not necessarily going to change that problem. That needs a different angle to it for us to achieve that.
Nikhil, thank you so much for joining us.